Montana Territory, May 1874. The wind carried dust across the dry plain as Francesca Vaughn stepped down from the stagecoach, her boots hitting the ground with the weight of someone who had stopped believing in second chances a long time ago. The driver tipped his hat, but she barely noticed. Her eyes scanned the small, sun-baked town of Dry Creek 1 Street, a handful of buildings, and not a soul who knew her. Just the way she wanted it. Francesca adjusted the collar of her worn blouse and turned away from the coach. She had nothing but a carpetbag, $15, and 2 children to keep alive. Ellie and Ethan stood close behind her, quiet and wide-eyed. Ellie clutched her mother's dress with one hand and held her little brother's hand with the other. "This is it?" Ellie asked, her voice soft. Francesca looked down at them. "This is where we start over." She had not planned to end up here. But after her husband rode out 5 months ago and never came back, the house in Kansas stopped feeling like home. The debts started piling up. The neighbors stopped offering help. And when the bank took the land, Francesca packed what she could, gathered her children, and headed west. The town was quiet at this hour, the sun low but still hot. Francesca walked with her children toward the boarding house, hoping there was a room they could afford. She had written ahead, but she had no guarantee. She did not see the cowboy on the other side of the street until the wind shifted, carrying his voice to her ears. "Ma'am, your boy's boot came untied." Francesca turned and saw him tall, dusty from the trail, with a tan hat pulled low over steady eyes. His shirt clung to his shoulders and a trail-worn duster hung open behind him. He stood beside a chestnut mare, reins in hand, the leather creaking softly. She looked down. Sure enough, Ethan's bootlace was trailing. "I got it," the cowboy said, already crouching. He tied the boy's boot with a quick, practiced hand and looked up with a calm smile. "There, good as new." Ethan nodded, shy but curious. "Thanks." Francesca pulled her children closer. "Thank you, mister. We can manage from here." The cowboy stood, brushing his hands on his trousers. "Name's Merritt Langston. I work on the Rafter L just south of town. You must be new." She hesitated. "We are," he nodded once, sensing her guard. "Well, welcome to Dry Creek." Francesca offered a polite nod and turned away. Inside the boarding house, the landlady, Mrs. Haskett, gave them a small room upstairs for a week's pay up front. It was tight, but clean. That night, after she tucked the children into the narrow bed, Francesca sat on the windowsill, staring out at the hills. Her fingers gripped the sill she had loved once, deeply. Enough to follow a man to the edge of the world. He had left her with 2 mouths to feed and no word of goodbye. She had not cried in 4 months. Not when the bank took the farm, not when she pawned her wedding ring, not when Ellie asked if Papa was ever coming home. Love, she had decided, was a lie people told each other when they were too scared to admit they were alone. The next morning, she asked around town for work. The schoolhouse needed a cleaning woman, $2 a week. She took it. She also offered to do mending, laundry, and cooking for any ranch hands in town. By week's end, she was rising before dawn and walking to the schoolhouse with a pail and rags, while Ellie watched over Ethan at the boarding house. On Wednesday, Merritt Langston found her sweeping the front steps of the school. "You clean all this yourself?" Francesca straightened, brushing hair from her face. "Yes," he leaned against the railing. "You should let someone help carry that pail." "I can handle it." He watched her, unreadable. "I believe you." "But there is no shame in letting someone take the weight once in a while." She met his eyes. "That's not how life works." "No," he said, "but sometimes it should." She turned back to her work, but part of her stayed with that moment longer than she wanted. Over the next week, Merritt showed up more, always in passing, always polite. Once he handed Ethan a wood-carved horse. Another time he brought Ellie a ribbon he claimed his sister out in Wyoming had sent, too short for her bonnet. Francesca said nothing, but she took note. One evening, she found him sitting on the porch of the boarding house, cleaning his saddle gear. "You following us?" she asked, arms crossed. He looked up. "Just waiting for Mrs. Haskett. I am buying one of her pies." Francesca raised an eyebrow. "You always wait out here," Merritt shrugged. I like watching the sky at this hour. She sat across from him on the porch rail. The sun was dripping gold over the hills, casting long shadows across the town. My husband walked out on us, she said suddenly, voice flat. Rode off and never looked back. Merritt looked over quiet. I do not believe in love anymore, she added, if I ever did. He did not speak for a long minute. Then he set the saddle down and stood. He walked over until he was just in front of her, close enough she had to tip her head to look him in the eye. I cannot speak for the past, he said, voice low. But love is not a promise made under the stars and forgotten at sunrise. She folded her arms, biting back something sharp. He leaned in the slightest bit, his voice barely above a whisper. Sometimes love is standing right here, she laughed, bitter and quick. You do not even know me. I know you scrub floors before dawn. I know you give your children the last bite of bread. I know you have not stopped fighting since the moment you stepped off that stagecoach. Her breath caught. I see you, he said, voice steady. And I am not going anywhere. She looked away, jaw tight. I do not need saving. I did not say you did. He tipped his hat and walked off into the dusk. Francesca stood there long after he was gone. Something in her chest had shifted just a little. The next morning, she found a small sack of flour and a tin of lard on her doorstep. No note. Just a ribbon wrapped around the sack, the same color as the one in Ellie's hair, 3 weeks past. The first snowmelt greened the prairie edges, and the cottonwoods along the creek behind the schoolhouse began to leaf out. Francesca found herself waking before the rooster crowed, not from worry anymore, but from habit. Her hands still ached from scrubbing and stitching, but the ache no longer felt like punishment, it felt like movement, like something turning forward instead of back. She took in laundry from the livery owner's wife and let Ellie help with sorting. Ethan had grown bold enough to venture as far as the alley behind the boarding house, where he dug in the dirt for bottle caps and beetles. The children had started sleeping through the night again. That was the first real mercy. One morning, as Francesca hung rinsed linens across the line behind the school, a man rode up the lane, a stranger in a way Merritt never had been. This one wore a dark coat, stiff like he wasn't used to riding long, and his horse's flanks were lathered. He dismounted without greeting and scanned the building as if looking for an answer it owed him. You the woman who came from Kansas with 2 young uns? He asked, dust clinging to his collar. Francesca's hands tightened on the clothespin in her fingers. I am. He nodded and glanced back toward the road. Name's Griffith. I broker cattle contracts, mostly for outfits north of here. Got word you might be looking for steadier work. I already have work. Not the kind that'll hold when winter comes. She pulled the next sheet from the basket. I'm not interested. Griffith paused. Langston's been asking about you. Francesca looked up then. Why would that matter to you? I don't care who you spend time with, Mrs. Vaughn, but that man's tied up in more than just cattle. He's got land eyes been watching, and not kindly. I'm saying be careful who you let near your children. She watched him mount again and ride off, his words staining the air behind him. She didn't need strangers with tight smiles telling her who to trust. Still, she folded the rest of the laundry inside and kept the children close for the rest of the day. That night, she found Merritt behind the feed store, elbow deep in a broken plow harness. His hands were slick with oil and dust. Why would someone say you're being watched? He didn't answer at first, just wiped his hands and looked past her toward the edge of town. Because I bought something they wanted, he said, and I didn't sell it back when asked. She stepped closer, her voice quiet. What was it? 40 acres south of the draw near Birch Hollow. Water runs clean through it. It used to belong to a widow who couldn't hold it after her boys died in the war. I paid her fair. Someone wanted it, a man named Carlin. He builds fences where no one asked him to. Thinks land should belong to the strongest voice at the table. Francesca crossed her arms. And he sent someone to warn me off you. Merritt's eyes met hers steady. I reckon that's what happened. Why didn't you say anything? Because you've had enough to carry. And I didn't want to give you another reason to walk away. She watched him then, the way the low light struck his face, carving out the wear of years lived mostly outdoors. She thought of how he always stood with his hands loose at his sides, never reaching, never pressing. "You should have told me," she said. "I know." She let the silence settle. Then, "I don't scare easy. I figured that out the day I saw you carry your boy across the street like you'd done it 100 times. She looked down, her voice quieter. "I don't like being made a fool of. You haven't been," he said. "Not by me." They stood there a while longer, neither moving. Then Francesca turned and walked away, not fast, not angry, just thinking. The next morning, she found Ellie sitting cross-legged beneath the cottonwood behind the boarding house, brushing her doll's hair with a pine twig. Ethan lay on his stomach nearby, humming as he traced lines in the dirt with a stick. She knelt beside them. "Would you two like to see a real ranch?" Ellie looked up, eyes wide. "A real one, with horses and chickens, maybe even a creek." Ethan rolled over. "Can we?" Francesca brushed a strand of hair from his forehead. "We'll ask Mr. Langston. If he says yes, we'll go on Sunday." That evening, after chores and supper, she walked to the rafter L on foot, following the fence line along the southern ridge. The sun had already dipped behind the hills, and the wind smelled like rain. She found Merritt near the barn, kneeling beside a lame colt, running his hand gently over its leg. "I'd like to bring the children out Sunday, if the invitation still stands." He stood slowly, brushing hay from his knees. "It does," she nodded. "And I'd like to see that land." "The one near the hollow." "Why?" "Because I want to know what a future looks like." He studied her face for a long moment. "Then I'll show you." She turned to go, but he caught her wrist lightly. "Francesca." She looked back. He didn't pull her close, didn't say anything more. Just held her gaze like a man who meant every word he hadn't said yet. She didn't pull away. The wind had picked up by Sunday morning, tugging at the hem of Francesca's skirt as she secured Ethan's coat buttons. Ellie stood by the gate, her boots polished and her hair brushed into a thick braid that hung down her back like a river of wheat. Merritt arrived just past the second church bell, riding a buckboard with a team of bays. He wore a wool vest and a clean shirt, sleeves rolled, and a brimmed hat that shaded his eyes but not the way they softened when he saw her. "You ready?" he asked, stepping down and reaching for Ethan first, lifting him into the wagon with practiced ease. Francesca climbed up last, settling beside Ellie on the broad seat. She didn't look at Merritt right away, but she felt his nearness like warmth from a nearby stove. The trail wound south, past the last of the town's outbuildings, then opened into tall grass and scattered willow groves. The sun sat high and bright, but the air still held a chill where snow had melted only days before. Ethan leaned against Francesca's arm, eyes drifting shut with the rhythm of the wheels. Ellie watched everything, her gaze sharp as her father's had once been. They reached the land by midday. It wasn't grand. No white fences or sweeping porch, just a patch of raw prairie where the earth rose and dipped with the memory of old glacial rivers. A creek ran through the center, lined with birch and alder, and in the distance, two hills leaned in like sentinels keeping quiet watch. Merritt pointed toward a low rise. "That's where I plan to build." House'll face the creek, windbreak of evergreens behind it, barn further west. Francesca stepped down, her boots sinking slightly in the soft earth. She walked toward the water, Ellie trailing behind. The girl knelt and dipped her fingers into the creek, then looked up. "It's cold." "That means it's clean," Merritt said, standing behind them now. "Snowmelt from the mountains, good for drinking, better for cattle." Francesca didn't answer. She crouched to run her hand through the grass. There were signs of deer-flattened patches and hoof prints, and the scent of wild mint hung faint in the air where the sun had warmed it. "Why this land?" she asked without looking up. "I wanted something no one else had ruined." She stood, brushing her hands. "And if they try to take it again, they'll have to come through me." They walked the property in a slow loop. Merritt showed them where an old homesteader had once dug a root cellar, long since collapsed, and the spot where he'd started laying stones for a corral. Francesca noticed how Ellie grew quiet, taking it all in but saying little. When they stopped to rest near the creek again, Merritt handed Ethan a biscuit from his saddlebag and offered Francesca the other. "I don't need more land," she said, watching the boy eat. "I need something that holds." "I'm not offering land," he said. "I'm offering a place to stay, a place to start if you want it," she turned to him. "And if I don't, then I'll keep building it anyway, but I'd rather build it with you." She said nothing for a long time. The sun moved westward. Birds flitted between the birch branches, their calls sharp and bright. Ellie stood and walked toward them. "Mama, could we plant corn here?" Francesca met her daughter's eyes. "Maybe. Could we build a chicken house like the one at Mrs. Haskett's?" Merritt answered before Francesca could. "We could build it better." Francesca looked at the man beside her, his face open, not expectant, just steady. She thought of the way he'd tied Ethan's boot, the ribbon he'd tied around the flour sack, the way he'd never once asked her to be anything but what she already was. "I don't know how to start again," she said. "You already have." She heard it then, in his voice, not a plea, not a promise, but something quieter, a kind of waiting. She stepped closer, just enough that their sleeves brushed. Merritt didn't move, didn't reach for her, but she saw the way his breath shortened. "I haven't said yes," she whispered. "I'll wait until you do." She reached for his hand then, fingers rough from work meeting his calloused palm, and held it. "I don't want to be rescued," she said. He closed his hand around hers. "Good, I never learned how." Ethan tossed a pebble into the creek. Ellie leaned against her mother's hip, watching the way Francesca's fingers stayed curled around Merritt's. "I think we could build something here," Francesca said quietly. Merritt nodded. "Then let's get started." By late June, the soil at Birch Hollow had darkened with rain, and the first posts of the corral were in the ground. Francesca drove nails into beams while Merritt held the frame steady, his shirt damp with sweat from the morning's labor. Ellie sat nearby under a shade tree, sewing a patch onto her dress with slow, careful stitches. Ethan napped on an old saddle blanket, thumb tucked between his teeth, his breath even. Francesca wiped her brow with the back of her wrist. "Wood straighter than I expected." "Thought we'd be fighting warps." Merritt leaned against the post, nodding toward the stack of lumber near the wagon. "Got it milled from cottonwoods upstream." "Old man Greeley owed me from last spring." "You collect debts in lumber, only the useful kind." She glanced at him, then back to the beam. "Makes sense." They worked in silence until the sun reached its peak. Then Merritt unwrapped a bundle of salted pork and corn dodgers from his saddlebag, dividing it evenly. Francesca took hers and leaned against the trunk beside Ellie. "You ever think you'd be building fence again?" Merritt asked her. "I never thought I'd have a reason to." He bit into his dodger and looked out over the creek. "You do now." Francesca didn't respond, but she didn't look away either. After the meal, Merritt took Ethan down to the creek's edge to toss pebbles into the current. Francesca watched them, her hands idle for once. Ellie leaned close and whispered, "He talks to Ethan like Papa used to, only quieter." Francesca traced a line in the dirt with her finger. "Does that bother you?" Ellie shook her head. "No. I think Ethan likes it." Later, as they packed tools into the wagon, Merritt touched Francesca's arm. "There's a dance next Saturday. Church folk are putting it on over in the Grange barn. Thought maybe you'd come." She didn't answer at first. Her gaze drifted toward the wagon where Ellie was helping Ethan up onto the bench. "I haven't danced since before Ethan was born." Merritt's voice was low. "No one said you had to. I wouldn't have anything to wear. I reckon you'd look right fine in whatever you came in." She met his eyes then, not with surprise, but with something slower, something that had been rising in her without her permission. She nodded once. "I'll think about it." He didn't press. That night, back at the boarding house, Francesca sat beside the window while Ellie folded small garments into a spare satchel. Moonlight spilled across the floor, catching the edge of Francesca's sewing kit. "Do you want to go?" Ellie asked, voice quiet. Francesca looked down at her hands. "I don't know, Mama," Ellie said after a moment. "You laugh different when he's around." Francesca turned her head sharply. "I laugh the same." "No," Ellie said, folding the last shirt. You laugh like you forgot you were tired. Francesca didn't answer, but she reached for the needle and thread. 3 days later, Mrs. Haskett offered Francesca a folded bundle wrapped in brown paper. Found this in a trunk in the attic. Belonged to my sister. She was a tall woman, too. Francesca opened it to find a blue calico dress, simple but well-made, with a high collar and a sash still sewn to the waist. I can't take this. You can, and you will. The day of the dance, the children stayed with Mrs. Haskett, who offered them strawberry preserves and a promise of a story before bed. Francesca took her time dressing. Her palms were damp as she braided her hair and pinned it up. She had not worn anything but work clothes in over a year. The calico felt strange against her skin, softer than it had any right to. Merritt arrived just after sundown, wearing a pressed shirt and the same hat he always wore. He didn't stare when he saw her, but his mouth pulled into something quiet and amazed. You look like something the sky made. Francesca rolled her eyes lightly. That's no kind of compliment. It is as if you've been staring at dirt for half your life. The Grange barn was lit by lanterns and strung with cedar boughs. Fiddle music spilled from the open doors, and the scent of yeast rolls and roasted squash filled the air. Francesca hesitated at the threshold, but Merritt offered his arm without speaking, and she took it. Inside, couples twirled across the wide plank floor. Merritt led her to a bench near the hayloft stairs and sat beside her, letting the noise fill the space between them. They watched the dancers, feet clapping in rhythm, skirts catching the light. You don't have to, you know, he said after a while. I know. Still, when the next tune slowed into something softer, she stood and held out her hand. I remember this one. He rose, surprised but calm, and took her hand. They moved into the open space, her steps careful at first, then steadier. Merritt's hand rested at her waist, warm through the cotton. She watched his collarbone, not his eyes, afraid to know what she might find there. Don't look down, he murmured. I'm not. You're thinking too loud. She smiled, just barely. I didn't know that showed. They turned again, the lanterns casting long shapes across the floor. She let herself follow the steps she had once known, let herself lean in just enough. When the music stopped, he didn't let go right away. Neither did she. Outside, the stars had scattered thick across the sky. Merritt walked her back to the boarding house, his hand at the small of her back, not claiming, just steady. At the porch, she turned to him. I don't know what this is yet. His voice was low. It doesn't have to be anything but real. She nodded, her breath caught in her throat. Do you believe me? He asked. She looked at him then, her voice barely more than a breath. I think I might. He leaned in, slow enough she could have stepped away. She didn't. When his mouth met hers, it was not hurried, not claiming. Just quiet, like a promise made without words. When she stepped inside, the children already asleep, Francesca leaned against the door and let herself close her eyes. For the first time in a long while, she didn't feel like she was waiting for something to go wrong. The first floor of the house stood by late July. Fresh-cut pine boards framed the windows where sunlight poured in unfiltered, and the scent of resin clung to the air like something newly born. Francesca stood near the east wall, running her hand over the smooth grain of a beam Merritt had planed himself only 2 days earlier. Her fingertips caught on a splinter, but she didn't pull away. I was thinking we might put the stove right there, Merritt said from behind her, pointing to the corner near the door. Keeps the heat close to the kitchen and the children's room. Francesca turned, brushing her hands on her apron. They'll sleep in the same room, for now. I'll build a second loft once we finish the roof. She studied the space, considering it. Ethan still wakes sometimes. He talks in his sleep. Then we'll keep them close. He'll settle. She nodded, watching him mark a measurement with his knife along the window frame. He moved without hesitation, every motion purposeful. The quiet between them had grown comfortable in recent weeks, filled with tasks and glances and the occasional touch that lingered longer than necessity. Outside, Ellie's voice rose in song, off-key but certain, as she helped gather wildflowers along the edge of the creek. Ethan followed her, dragging a stick behind him through the dust, humming something tuneless. "I spoke to Mr. Tollefson yesterday," Francesca said, folding her arms. "He's looking to retire from the schoolhouse come winter." Merritt looked up. "You thinking of taking it on?" I'd have to study some. And I'd need to ask around for books. You've always known more than most men I've met." "That's not saying much," he laughed, the kind of low, surprised sound she still wasn't used to hearing from him. "It's saying enough." She leaned against the frame, watching the children through the open wall. "I don't want them to grow up feeling like they had to earn their place in every room they walked into. They won't, not with you raising them." She turned to him, her face unreadable. "And you? I'll be right there beside you if you'll let me." The words hung for a moment, not heavy, just sure. She didn't answer right away. Instead, she walked to the doorway and stepped outside, letting the breeze lift the ends of her braid. Merritt followed, standing beside her as the children chased each other through the tall grass. "I'm not afraid of the work," she said finally, "or the winter, or the long days. I know. I'm afraid of needing someone again." He didn't move. "You already do." "That's the truth of it." She looked at him, her jaw set, but her eyes softening at the edges. "And what if you leave?" "I won't." "You can't promise that." "I can promise I won't choose to." She held his gaze, then looked back out over the land. "All right." He didn't ask what she meant. He didn't need to. That evening, as the sun dipped low and painted the hollow in gold, Francesca sat on the unfinished porch with her children curled beside her. Merritt returned from the barn with a folded blanket and draped it across their laps without a word. Then he sat beside Francesca, his hand settling over hers, fingers warm and familiar. Ellie yawned and leaned her head against her mother's shoulder. "Will we live here forever?" Francesca looked down at her, brushing a bit of grass from her cheek. "That's the plan." Ethan stirred. "Even when it snows?" "Especially then," Merritt said, his voice quiet. They sat like that until the stars began to press through the darkness and the crickets started their song. The house behind them was still roofless, the walls just a skeleton, but it held them, already like a home. By the end of August, the roof was on, the stove was installed, and the beds were in place. Francesca and the children moved in on a Sunday, bringing with them a single trunk, a box of books, and a jar of dried beans the size of her forearm. Merritt carried it all inside without comment. The first night, after the children had fallen asleep in their shared bed, Francesca stood at the kitchen table, drying her hands on a cloth. Merritt leaned against the doorframe, watching her. "I've been thinking," he said. She raised an eyebrow. "You ought to have your name on the land deed," she blinked. "That's yours." "It's ours now." He didn't reach for her, just waited. She folded the cloth slowly. "You want to marry me?" "I do," she exhaled. "I've never been asked like that." "Do you want me to get down on one knee?" "I want you to look me in the eye like you always do." He stepped closer. "Francesca Vaughn, will you marry me?" She didn't speak. She stepped into him, wrapped her arms around his waist, and rested her head against his chest. "That's a yes," she said. He held her like she was something he'd built with his own hands and never meant to let go of. They were married in the clearing by the creek, with Ellie holding wildflowers and Ethan trying not to fidget. Mrs. Haskett brought apple cake. Merritt wore his Sunday vest. Francesca wore calico and her hair pinned up with a comb Merritt had carved himself. The house filled with warmth and smell of bread and the quiet steadiness of a life being lived well. Francesca taught at the schoolhouse by winter, walking there with Ellie each morning. Merritt ran the ranch, the herd growing slow and honest. Ethan grew taller, steadier. Ellie read by lantern light until Francesca made her put the books away. One night, as snow whispered against the windows and the fire burned low, Merritt pulled Francesca close beside him on the settee. "You ever think about Kansas?" he asked. "Not anymore." He kissed her temple, his breath steady against her skin. "This is home," she said, and it was. Forever and without question.